Welcome to Invest Well, Be Well, a podcast for wiser investing and stronger living. I'm Rusty Vanneman, longtime investment professional, and I'm joined each week by my co-host, Robin Murray.
Thanks, Rusty. I'm a storyteller and journalist, and I am so excited to explore the ideas, insights, and people shaping the intersection of performance and purpose.
This podcast is for thoughtful investors and driven professionals who want to grow in their portfolios and in their personal lives.
We'll talk long-term investing, behavioral finance, personal development, and what it takes to live and work with intention.
So let's get started. Let's invest well and be well together.
This podcast is brought to you by Main Management LLC. Since 2002, Main has been recognized as an ETF strategist that combines an institutional process with the personalized service of a boutique firm.
Invest Well, Be Well is also sponsored by State Street Investment Management. Founded as a pioneer in ETFs, State Street Investment Management, through its SPDR brand, brought the first U.S. ETF to market with a SPDR S&P 500 ETF trust, commonly known by its ticker symbol, SPY.
Our guest today is Bob Heller. He is a leading economist, former Federal Reserve governor, former head of Visa. Just an amazing career, super interesting personal background. What a fascinating interview.
We have had so many prominent people, so many rock stars on the podcast, but nobody has a biography like Bob Heller does. And let's just see, I got plenty of notes here. Born in Germany, German-American economist, became an economist over here, a governance and leadership veteran. And again, his story spans from post-war Germany to the heights of global finance. He was born in Cologne, Germany in 1940. He immigrated to the United States. He earned his PhD in economics at UC Berkeley, but he had other college visits before that, and he had told some really fun stories there. And then he embarked on a remarkable career. He did teach economics at UCLA and the University of Hawaii. He served as the chief of financial studies division at the International Monetary Fund. Then he was a senior vice president at the International Economic Research at Bank of America. So already these are huge roles. In 1986, though, President Ronald Reagan nominated Dr. Heller to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, where he served until 1989. And he had many prominent roles there at the Federal Reserve. He later made a major pivot into the private sector, and he became president and CEO of Visa, as in the credit card, USA, leading the nation's largest retail cards payment network during a transformative era. He did write a book. His memoir is called The Unlikely Governor, subtitled An American's Immigrant Journey from Wartime Germany to the Federal Reserve Board. And again, it tracks an extraordinary life and draws leadership and governance lessons that align perfectly with our mission here at Invest Well, Be Well, to help you invest more wisely and live stronger. And we did not have enough time to go through all of it.
No.
But what were some of your takeaways?
Yes, we did not have enough time. He had so many great stories. He's had such an interesting life, such an interesting perspective. As you said, he's born in Germany, but that was during the war. So his first years were World War II in Germany. And, just talking about how that experience shaped him and how that informed decision-making decades later. He's had such an interesting vantage point from the head of Visa and the former, Federal Reserve governor. We asked him about the role of central banks, his take on cryptocurrencies, which was super interesting. And again, how he makes decisions based on all of that experience and perspective that he's had. So just super interesting. Also, I don't think either of us are ever going to compete with the wall hangings that he has in his office.
Nope.
That's just super cool. I mean, pretty good stuff.
Again, he's had so many big jobs, so many amazing experiences. We couldn't do justice to all of it. But nonetheless, there's some great history lessons in here, some great stories, a lot of things to draw inspiration from, and something a little bit different from our typical podcast is I like to think we asked a couple questions that are a little more controversial than normal. And it was interesting to get his take, and he did not hold back. And with all that said, he was a real joy to talk to, not only in the interview, but it was so much fun to talk to before we turned on the recorder. And he was so much fun after the interview. Just a real treat of an interview.
Absolutely. Well, let's take a listen. Bob, welcome to Invest Well, Be Well. It's so good to have you on the show.
Good to be here with both of you.
Well, Bob, this is going to be a real treat for us. And our first question is a tradition in our podcast. And that is we always ask for a walk-up song to set the tone for the interview. What is your walk-up song?
You want me to sing it?
Oh, that's better.
Mich Heimat denke und sind dort oben so für mir stand, möcht ich direkt ob Heimat schwenke, ich möcht zu Fuß nach Köln. That's the song from my hometown, Cologne, Germany. And it says basically, I want to walk back home to Cologne.
Yep. That is awesome. I always love when people sing their walk-up songs. Those are the best.
Elvis has been in Cologne. He would sound better than me.
They sounded pretty good. That was great. Okay, well, as you said, you grew up in Cologne, Germany, and that was in and after World War II. So that really must have shaped your worldview. Can you talk about what early experiences taught you lessons about risk, scarcity, humility, all those things that still guide you today, whether that's in investing or leadership or for yourself?
Well, like you said, I was born actually during World War II in 1940. And so times at the beginning were not all that bad. You know, war was on, but nothing much was happening. But once the war turned and there were almost daily attacks by air on Cologne, because Cologne was a big industrial city. It was the furthest industrial city towards the west, so it could be reached by bombers from England long before they could reach Berlin or Frankfurt or other towns further east in Germany. So our family spent quite a bit of time in the cellars. Eventually we were evacuated to East Germany. Then the Russians came from that side. We were back to West Germany and in a small town called Königswinter near the Drachenfels, which is called the Dragon's Rock. It's now a national park, and we were living there with some friends of ours. We had a small hotel, and at the very end of the war, you may remember there was the first crossing of the Rhine by the Americans in a town called Remagen. There was even the famous movie, The Bridge of Remagen. At that time, holy hell broke loose. Both the Germans as well as the Americans were attacking us. And my mother and I, we lived in a cave for 2 or 3 weeks. And that's still something that I do remember. I was 5 years at that time. Well, which little boy wouldn't want to live in a cave?
You know, I do have a copy of The Unlikely Governor, which I've read most of it. And the one part about Cologne, as you're talking about on the bombing, and one thing that stuck out with me, and kind of mentioned this, is that even if the bombers had other missions, if they had leftover bombs, they just dropped them on Cologne.
That's right. You see, that was true even at the end of the war. If a bomber from England would fly to Berlin, let's say, and Berlin was overcast and they couldn't find their targets, they couldn't drop their bombs, then they were turning back with a full bomb load and they couldn't land with a full bomb load. So they had to drop it, and they dropped it on the last big target in Germany before they were over friendly territory in France or in Belgium again. So Cologne got it coming and going. 95% of all buildings were destroyed.
Amazing. I can't even imagine.
Wow. So can you talk about your experience then later in life as an immigrant to the U.S.? What cultural or psychological adjustments did you make? And how did those experiences prepare you for some of the high stakes roles that you've had, like a Fed governor and the head of Visa?
Well, that's a big question. Probably should break it down in a few small ones. I came to the United States because I wanted to follow my girlfriend at that time. She had gotten a scholarship to go to a small college in Winona, Minnesota, College of St. Teresa. And I said, oh, I want to come to somewhere nearby. I applied to about 80 some colleges in the area, southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and eventually a small college, Parsons College in Fairfield, Iowa, gave me a full scholarship, tuition, room and board, and also paid me like $50 a month. I thought I'd gone to heaven. But when I arrived there, I found out that it was also known as Flunk Out U, or as Mid-America's worst college, because they specialized in taking kids who had first gone, let's say, to Princeton or to Dartmouth or to Harvard, and they had a good time. They drank a lot, they partied a lot, and they flunked out of Dartmouth. Then they went to Michigan State or Iowa State, but they kept on partying. And then they flunked out again. And so nobody else would touch them anymore, and Parsons would welcome them, and they were still partying. So I thought America was a very friendly country. Everybody had a good time, was drinking, and I liked it. I liked Parsons.
No doubt those students had very good social skills, though.
Excellent social skills, and they also had wealthy parents.
Yeah. I'm sure they did fine post-graduation.
So, in a way, America was a land of opportunity. There was a lot of new culture that I learned. For the first time, somebody took me to play golf in the local country club. And, well, even Iowa was paradise for me.
Yeah.
And you had good food.
Yeah. So what kind of lessons did you learn from that experience, coming into an entirely new country, learning a new culture? How did that prepare you for later in life?
Well, you had to adapt, and you had to make the best out of the situation. So I found it actually fairly easy to come from Europe. Most of the people in Fairfield were very welcoming, much more so than you would have expected Europeans to be. They were more reserved. Americans are more outgoing, and I liked the overall culture. So even after my girlfriend went back to Europe, I decided to stay, and I found there was a land of opportunity. So I got my BA degree in only 1 year. The competition wasn't very hard there at Parsons, like I mentioned before. But then I went to the University of Minnesota, where I worked as a dorm counselor, trying to keep 40 or 50 ice hockey players in line who were living in a dorm. That was a challenge, certainly. Yeah, I wasn't really up to the task, but it was a way to make a living and get my way paid through the University of Minnesota. But it got awfully cold there in the wintertime, January, February, March. It was still cold. There was still snow on the ground. I said, I got to get out of here. So I applied at Berkeley, Stanford, UCLA, and SC. And Berkeley offered me a nice teaching assistantship. And I moved to Berkeley for my PhD degree. And here again, it was really an opportunity to do things that I would not have been able to accomplish in Germany. Back in Germany, to become an academic, to be a professor, you had to be born into a family of academics, of professors. Your father had to be either teaching at a university, a lawyer, or an accomplished doctor, or something like that. Here, I got my PhD from Berkeley, and immediately I became a professor at UCLA. It was a great university as well. And again, it was an opportunity. When I went back to Germany, for instance, I went back to a high school reunion, and my one of my teachers came up to me and he said, "Now tell me, Bob, is it really true that you are a professor? You must be kidding us." And I said, "No, I'm a professor. I'm 25 years old." And he wouldn't believe me. In Germany, that would have been an absolute impossibility to achieve. America was the land of opportunity, and I tried to avail myself of these opportunities.
Well, it sounds like, given some of that backdrop, that one of those experiences that clearly helped prepare you for a role as a Federal Reserve Governor and the head of Visa was basically looking over 20 hockey players at University of Minnesota. I'm sure those skills came in very handy.
I tell you one thing, it was, and I won't tell you the stories. They had a good time.
Yeah.
In those days, there were no co-ed dorms, but there were plenty of high-heel click, click, clicks going home at 2 o'clock in the morning of my dorm.
Yeah. Back then, Minnesota was a powerhouse in every sport, not just hockey. So I'm sure it was a pretty interesting time. Well, the next question is, again, your biography is so fascinating. And again, The Unlikely Governor is such a great read. And really, because we only have so much time, because this could be like a 3-part podcast series easy, but we really want to dive into some of the lessons. And when you moved from academia into international finance and the International Monetary Fund, and then into the U.S. central banking world, and later into payments and corporate leadership. So what were some of the hardest parts of each of those transitions? And were there skills that you acquired in one realm that turned out to be surprisingly useful in another?
Well, actually, there was one common theme to all the jobs I ever had, and that was finance. They all had to do with finance in one way, shape, or another. Either I was teaching money and banking or international finance classes at the university, then at the International Monetary Fund, which was really in those days, the center of the world for central bank relations and international finance. After that, it was Bank of America. I was running the International Economics group. Again, it was all about finance. Which way were the monies flowing? What were the new opportunities for Bank of America to avail itself? At that time, Bank of America was the largest bank in the world. And so, again, it was finance. And then came the call to be at the Federal Reserve. Again, it was finance and bank supervision and regulation. We can talk more about that. I was the chairman of Bank Supervision and Regulation during my time at the Federal Reserve. Nowadays, that's a vice chairman's job. In those days, you were just chairman of that committee. And then Visa, at that time, a fast, rapidly growing organization. We had only 350 employees. Now it is 20,000 or so. But even in those days, it was an organization that was truly spanning the globe as far as personal finance is concerned. So finance was a common theme, and different applications and different ways to implement it. It was actually more similar than you might have thought.
Well, we have a lot of questions on the Federal Reserve. And so in your book, The Unlikely Governor, you did offer inside views of the internal dynamics of the Fed during your tenure. Could you share just one decision or moment from that period that still gives you pause, or what you learned from it?
Well, the most difficult thing wasn't one decision, but it was a series of decisions. If you recall, in the mid-1980s, the entire savings and loan industry basically disappeared. When I got to the Federal Reserve, there were about 15,000 commercial banks in the United States. As I said, I was the chairman of Bank Supervision Regulation. Every year, around 800 banks failed. So on my watch, about 2,500 banks failed. Every Thursday, we would get a piece of green paper, and on that piece of green paper, there were 10 to 12 banks listed, and it said at the top, the following banks are scheduled to fail on this weekend. We had a day's notice ahead of the time. Friday afternoon, the FDIC would march into these banks, close them up over the weekend, take them over, and either try to sell them to another bank to acquire them, to run it, or take it over. And then there was a whole company called the Resolution Trust Corporation, the RTC, whose job it was to take over these financial organizations. So that was really a spellbinding time, a lot of turmoil in financial markets, and to keep it all on an even keel, I think was not all that easy. And if you look at it with the benefit of hindsight now, if you would ask somebody, what was the most important event of the last century, previous century, I think very few people would point at the 80s. And it was a total revamping of the financial system in the United States. And out of it then came, a little bit later, the lessons learned was more diversity for the financial institutions, to have banks that would be both consumer and business-oriented banks, as well as investment banks, some which didn't exist in the United States before that due to the Glass-Steagall separation of commercial banking and investment banking. And also interstate banking didn't exist when I got to the Federal Reserve. That all happened in the 80s and the 90s. And now we have these gigantic financial institutions, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and Citibank, covering the entire country. Before that, that was impossible. Banks were confined to one state, and in some states, like for instance Texas, there was even a unit banking system where you had only one single office, and that was it. You couldn't branch.
That is amazing to think about. I mean, I do remember the savings loan crisis, but I was a high school kid, so I didn't remember with the same pain and emotion that, all the adults were feeling, and obviously have studied it looking back, and what a time that was.
Yeah. Well, you see, in a way, you asked what were the lessons learned and my background, how was it helpful? Having grown up in Europe, where they had what the Europeans called universal banks, for me was a natural thing to have investment banks and commercial banks together. And the advantage, obviously, was that they were more stable institutions because they had the possibility to diversify more. They had more diversified portfolios. They had different ways to earn money. They had more capital. And as a result, you had overall more stable organizations.
So as a Fed governor, during times of stress, crisis that you lived through, how did you manage disagreements on the governor's board or friction?
Well, we had two outstanding leaders when I was there. First of all, there was Paul Volcker, who was the chairman when I arrived at the Federal Reserve. There was a lot of controversy at that particular time, and I'm happy to talk about it. There was a vice chairman of the Federal Reserve at that time. His name was Press Martin. He was from San Francisco here. He had been an innovator in the financial system, started a company called PMI, Private Mortgage Insurance, and he was the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. there was a lot of turnover. Wayne Angel and Martha Seeger and Manley Johnson had just gotten on the board. These were all appointees by President Reagan. And Press Martin had traveled through Japan and given a speech. And then Chairman Volcker, he and I, they didn't quite see eye to each other. And when Volcker was asked what he thought of Martin's speech, he said something like it was incomprehensible. Well, Martin was pretty upset. Martin went to the White House and he said, hey, Volcker's term is up half a year from now. Will I be the new chairman? And the White House apparently said, well, you are one of the candidates, but no promises. So Martin quit. And that created another vacancy on the Federal Reserve Board, very similar to what is happening right now, where there are 3 President Trump appointees on the Federal Reserve Board, but it takes 4 to be a majority. So, like I said, President Reagan had already appointed 3 new governors. Martin had resigned. Now there was a 4th. There was a vacancy. And I was traveling in Japan, I remember. In the middle of the night, the phone rang, and a female voice said, this is the White House calling. And I thought, oh, God, it must be one of your friends trying to play a dumb joke on you, And I was about ready to hang up. And the lady said, she says, well, if you can, could you come by Washington and have an interview whether you want to be considered to be on the Federal Reserve Board? And suddenly I thought, wow, this is for real. And so I said, of course, I'll be there as soon as I get back to the United States. That was the first I heard about this opening. And there were interviews done just like now. There were, I think, 4 people who were in the final round of interviews. It was exciting to go to the White House, being interviewed by Don Regan, who was the chief of staff, Jim Baker, who was the secretary of the Treasury. And so lucky enough, I made it, and I became then the decisive vote on the Federal Reserve, on the board, because I was a new member. And I was lucky in another way because Press Martin was from San Francisco, and I was also living in San Francisco. And as you know, the governors have to be from different Federal Reserve districts. And so San Francisco was open. If I had been living in New York, it would have been probably no good.
I can only imagine the people back in Germany that were surprised that you were a teacher, what they thought when you were a Federal Reserve governor.
Well, one very prominent German politician called me a traitor because I'd gone to the United States. But he was a leader of one of the big parties in Germany.
Wow. Can only imagine.
I want to ask you about your time at Visa as well. You described Visa as torn between chaos and order. So how did you strike the balance in practice when you were at Visa? And can you give an example of a tough decision that you made to preserve innovation?
Well, what you bring up there is actually the title of a book which was written by Dee Hock, who was often considered as the founder of Visa. Because, as you know, as far as the history is concerned, there was Bank of America here in California, which actually had pioneered the credit card for consumers. And that was called the Bank of America card. And that was in the late 50s, early 60s or so. And it was a card that was only initially in California. But then people wanted to use the card also out of state when they traveled to New York, to Chicago, or Denver, or wherever they were going to be. So Bank of America started to franchise the system. And these were franchises all across the country then. And then when I got to Visa, it was an association that was owned by the member banks. They were the shareholders. They were the owners of Visa. And D. Hock had marched in just a few years before I got there. And he was representing one of those banks, a small bank in Washington State. And he led the revolt of all the banks against Bank of America. They marched in together and said to the president of Bank of America, either you give us ownership rights or we all join MasterCard. And so there wasn't much choice. Bank of America gave them the ownership rights, and Visa became a company owned by all its member banks. And they constituted the board of directors. So you had people sitting there representing Bank of America, Citibank, Chase, and so on. All the major banks that were also Visa card issuers. And what D. Hock wanted to do, bring out the very best in front of these member banks. And he asked himself, how am I going to do that? And he said, he would go around, for instance, he would tell to you, Rusty, he'd say, Rusty, I want to start a new prepaid card or something like that. Don't tell anybody about it. You work on the project for 6 weeks and come up with the concept and what the card should look like. Then, unbeknownst to you, Rusty, he would go over to Robin. And he'd say, Robin, secret, you work on this card. And he had 4 or 5 people, all independently working on the same project. When the 6 weeks were over, he would call all of them together in one room. He said, oh, you have not known that you're all working on the same project. Now, present your cases, and we will pick whoever has the best concept. That will become the new card. And so people were very mistrustful of each other when I got to Visa. Everybody was looking over his shoulder or her shoulder and see what the other people were doing and so on. So that was the chaos of Visa. Why did D. Hock do it? He wanted to present the absolutely best concept to his board of directors, and most of those directors were also people who were either running the credit card division or the entire retail division in their respective big bank. So they had a lot of knowledge, and he wanted to have the absolute best concept brought in front of the board. So he wanted to have this internal competition. At the same time, he wanted to, once the concept was presented and adopted, he wanted to have order. So he wrote this book about chaos and order called The Chaotic Organization. And D. Hock was the author of it. And that was really the DNA of Visa. It was, in my days, ingrained in the corporation. Nowadays, it's a totally different game. About 20 years ago, it became a public company. And, it's run now by an outside board of directors, not an inside board like it was before. And you have excellent leadership. The fellow who runs the company now is Ryan McInerney. He's the CEO of Visa, and he lives a few blocks up the hill here from where I live.
Fascinating stories. I want to go back to central banking, though. So from your vantage point as a former Fed governor, how do you see the evolving role of central banks today? And kind of adding into that, where does cryptocurrencies come into all of that?
Well, good question. Central banks clearly are for each country, or in the case of Europe, for the European Union, for all the European countries together, they are the central organization that does not only issue usually the currency of that particular country, but also provides an important payment system, a payment system that's focused largely on the interbank market, where all the banks in the United States have accounts at the Federal Reserve, and they transact these transactions for the banks. It is also the banker for, essentially, the banker for the United States. The Treasury pays its bills. Treasury has a big account at the Federal Reserve and pays its bills. The Federal Reserve also lend money to other central banks when they get into difficulties. Right now, you see, and again in the news, that that there will be a big loan made to Argentina. And in my days, Volcker really tried to play an important role in these international banking things, or in these international banking transactions. So, in addition, it's one of the many bank supervisors that we have in the country. We got two, if you don't mind me saying so. We have too many bank supervisors in the United States. There's the controller of the currency, which charters federal banks. There's a banking commissioner or equivalent for each state in the United States. So there are 50 of them. They charter state charter banks. Then there's the FDIC that supervises the banks because they are the insurance company for the banks. Then there's the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which does exactly the same as the Federal Reserve is supposed to do in its Consumer Affairs Division. So you have two federal agencies whose job is to just help consumers in their relations with the banking system. Frankly, it's a mess. Too many cooks spoil the broth. It would be much better for the United States to have a simplified oversight over the banking system instead of having small banks sitting there and a whole parade of supervisors from the Federal Reserve, from the controller of the currency, from the FDIC, and so on, coming in every 3-4 weeks with a different group. Some of them even have a permanent office in the bigger banks. It's over-regulation, and I hope we can clean up that one. You talked about crypto. At the moment, the Federal Reserve doesn't do anything really in crypto. They will probably get involved in crypto. Visa, for instance, has just recently announced that they will be getting involved in crypto. And it is not so much for crypto in the United States. If I want to make a payment to you, I have no problem making that payment. But if I want to make a payment to another country, from here to Argentina, from here to Spain, from here to Vietnam or Cambodia, that is a more difficult transaction. And I think crypto will have a legitimate role to play, that I can just say, okay, I will send you some stable coins. I make this payment for whatever I'm buying from you, a painting or some clothing or a new car, whatever it may be. I make you the payment in stable coins, and you can use the stable coins in your country. So internationally, I can see a big role for that, as well as in some countries that don't have a very well-developed banking system. A stable coin may be a very useful product there. In the United States, I think the average person really doesn't need it. But if you are, let's say, a migrant worker and you don't have a bank account in the United States, it may be an easy thing to transmit your money to another country. And again, recent news, I just saw in the paper that Western Union, which transacts a lot of that business from the United States to third world countries, they want to introduce their own stable coin in order to take the place probably of Western Union transmissions.
This episode of Invest Well, Be Well is brought to you by Main Management LLC, a pioneer in actively managed ETFs since 2002. Main Management starts with a clear fiduciary focus, delivering the transparency and personal attention you'd expect from a boutique firm. They provide financial advisors with solutions, not products. Main also believes investors should keep more of what they earn, emphasizing net of fee after-tax performance to help clients retain more of their returns. I've known Main Management for years. I've met thousands of managers over the course of my career, and one quality I really value: they invest alongside their clients. They eat their own cooking. Over 10% of the assets they manage are their own partner assets, and more than half of the firm are partners themselves. That says a lot. To learn more about Main strategies, including buy right hedged equity, U.S. sector rotation, thematic innovation, and all asset models, please visit their website at mainmgt.com.
So in your career, you've seen a lot of market conditions. You've seen banking stress, you've seen market turbulence. What do you think are the characteristics that really separate financial systems that survive crises from those that don't?
I think the one common denominator is adequate capital. Banks and other financial institutions need adequate capital, their own money at risk, which is there to back up the financial transactions that take place. If somebody doesn't have enough capital, or if the capital adequacy of the institution is being questioned, then you have the potential for financial turmoil and difficulties. So I think that's the one common denominator that I would really focus on. And that's what bank supervision really should focus on: adequacy of capital. Then you have people who will watch out for their own benefit, that the company will do well, that the bank will do well, that the financial institution will do well, that they won't make any losses or things like that. If none of their own money is at risk, if none of the shareholders' capital is at risk, then they're ready to gamble. And that's when you get your financial calamities and problems.
So Robin's question was more about banking, and my question is more about investing. And who knows, maybe it's the same answer, but what are some of the warning signals that you look for, or at least wish investors would look for, in the financial markets or institutions that may be too fragile?
Well, if the banks and other, broker-dealers like Schwab, Fidelity, they obviously do the financial transactions. And again, it's important for them to have adequate capital. If you don't have anything, then you get somebody like a Bernie Madoff, who is tempted to grab the capital and to use it for his own speculative purposes. That's no good. So you want to look at, well, I'm back to capital adequacy. Any financial institution has to have it, and that's the main thing you want to focus on. Also, if you're holding bonds of a certain company out there, again, the company got to have enough capital to service, make the interest payments on the bonds, and eventually repay the bonds. So having their own capital or access to adequate credit lines, that's something that you want to look at if you want to minimize your own risk.
Yeah. All right, Bob, I have a fun question for you here. And that is, you are known to not be a believer in Keynesian economics, which again advocates for government intervention to stabilize economies, particularly during downturns. So can you tell us why you think Keynesian economics doesn't work? I mean, aren't we all Keynesians in recessions?
No, I'm not a Keynesian. I went to a Keynesian university. Berkeley certainly had its share of Keynesians on the faculty. But then I taught at UCLA. And UCLA, that's where I really learned my lessons in monetary economics. Milton Friedman, probably the best economist of the last century, was a frequent visitor at UCLA because, as you know, he was teaching at the University of Chicago, but the winters are very cold in Chicago. So quite often he would come out to UCLA and teach the winter quarter at UCLA. There were other great free market economists there. Friedrich Hayek was one who would also show up a lot. So I rubbed shoulders with the very best of them, like Milton Friedman. Bob Mundell was another person I got to know very well a little bit later. He was associated with the International Monetary Fund, and his famous co-author, Mr. Fleming, he was actually my boss at the International Monetary Fund when I was there. So I saw in many cases the importance of money and the money supply, and what I think is really wrong with the current policy of the Federal Reserve is that they do not look at money at all. They are basically all Keynesians. The entire staff is of Keynesian persuasion. They don't look money. Try to look at an FOMC statement. You will not find the word money in there for the last four or 5 years. They just don't look at it. And as a result, they are running the Federal Reserve looking at the rearview mirror rather than looking ahead, because what's happening to the money supply is a superb indicator of what happens in the real economy, in the actual economy, about 1 year or 18 months later. As Milton Friedman said famously, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and it affects the real economy with a long and variable lag, 1 year to 18 months, roughly in that time period. And when I got to the Federal Reserve, it was already that way. They were basically steering the economy with what the Federal Reserve called the University of Pennsylvania Larry Klein econometric model. And again, it had very little monetary aspects to it. So I hired one of my colleagues from Bank of America, a fellow by the name of Cal Vajid, to run a monetarist model when I was at the Federal Reserve, so I could present my own views what monetary policy should be like.
Yeah, fascinating. You know, kind of related to all this, just kind of my own backstory. Once upon a time, the book I used to gift the most to friends and family was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. So, you know, I don't think anybody ever ended up saying, Rusty, this book was awesome. So I kind of transitioned away from giving economics books to other kind of books. But anyway, that book I gave away to a lot of people.
Okay. Now you got a new book to give away to people, right?
Right.
Likely Governor.
Right. That's right. Dude, that's a very good idea.
Well, I also want to ask you about your decision making. You've had to make really important decisions at really high levels, really high stakes decisions, and often with incomplete information. So can you tell us, how did you make those kinds of decisions? What mental framework, mental model were you trying to adapt?
Good question. Well, when I was a little kid, the bombs were falling when we were sitting in the cellar. And obviously you're hoping that they wouldn't fall on your own house while you were sitting down there. So I told myself it was Puss in Boots, the cat in the boots. What's the title of the book again?
Puss in Boots. Yeah.
Puss in
You
Boots.
had it right. Yeah.
I thought it was Puss in Boots marching across, on top of me, going bang, 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 as the bombs were falling. It sounded to me like a cat was walking along there. And I thought, well, that was, 4 or 5 years old. This must be Puss in Boots in his gigantic boots up there. That's how I tuned out, I guess, horrible things. Doesn't really answer your question, but it's decision-making under uncertainty. Often things are happening that you really cannot control, and then you just sit there and you buckle down, and you'll be sure that your cellar doors are locked, that you are safe. And the same thing, I guess, if financial turmoil is happening out there, you try to retreat to a very safe place, maybe have a little bit of gold or some gold stocks available, and you hope that you never have to use all those gold coins or Krieger ants. But I do have them in my safe deposit box.
Yeah. So another theme in our podcast is stronger living. So we do want to ask you about that as well. How did you manage your work-life balance when you had such a high-pressure career and life?
I should ask my wife on that question. She would probably say that I didn't have any good work-life balance. Obviously, I traveled a lot, going to conference, going to meetings. When I was at the Federal Reserve, I was the delegate, for instance, to the OECD in Paris. And every 5 to 6 weeks, I had to fly over to Europe to go to meetings there. Later on at Visa, we were operating all the way around the world, had meetings all over the world. And if I'd come home, remember one time my kids were sitting there saying, "Oh, look, Daddy's home. He's having dinner with us." It was a surprise for them. I probably neglected the kids in the family, and I was lucky enough to have my wife to take care of them. So they grew up to be great people as well. And it takes a family to do it all. And I was lucky in that respect that I had their support.
Well, speaking of family, Bob, before this interview, I talked to Kim Arthur, and he's, of course, one of the founding partners of Main Management. And we asked him what question we should ask you. He gave us a few ideas, but one was he wanted to know about your father and how he was always ready for another war after having experienced World War II. Can you tell us a bit more about that story? And how did your early life experiences influence how you think about wealth, fulfillment, and what it means to live well?
Oh, a lot of questions again at the same time. Okay, let's start with my father. He was drafted in late 1939. And so that was the time when Hitler was, building up the army. And my father, he had lived in Ireland for a couple of years in the 1930s, maybe 3 years or so. He wanted to sell Madonnas to the Irish. He knew they were Catholic. He thought there was a business model. Anyhow, he wasn't too successful in that endeavor. He came back to Germany, and eventually he was drafted. But because he spoke excellent English with an Irish accent, he was made a translator. And that was probably the luckiest thing that happened to him, because he spent the entire 5 years of World War II as a translator. I can show you, well, we're not on the TV here, but I have his old pass from his army service. And on the first day, he was a private called a Special Leader Z. And the last day of the war, he was a Special Leader Z as a private. He never got a promotion. He was always a translator. But he was always attached to headquarters, or most of the time he was attached to headquarters. First in Holland, I have pictures of him sitting in Paris in wonderful chalets next to the Eiffel Tower. He had a great time. Then he was in the Sahara Desert together with General Rommel, again, as a translator. So he had the grand tour of Europe without ever being shot at, or I don't think he ever shot at another person either, the entire war. And eventually he was taken prisoner in northern Italy at the end of the war. He was first in American and then in a British POW camp for half a year only. The Brits let him go. And guess what? The Brits immediately hired him again. A, he had a clean record, and B, they needed translators. So he was a translator for the American occupation troops. That was it. Eventually, he worked for Lufthansa Airline and doing landing rights, again, where he had to use his English to negotiate landing rights all over the world. And that was a job that he had for the rest of his life. He and I don't know, we weren't the best of friends. My mother died when I was 6 years old during a typhoid epidemic right after the war, 1 year after World War II ended. So it was basically my grandmother and my aunts that raised me, and I liked it. I loved it. My grandfather was a distiller. He owned a distillery, a liquor store, a restaurant, and a bar, all in the same building. And as a little kid, I got pictures of myself in the cellars of Cologne, rolling kegs around. I know later on my job was to put labels on the bottles that he was selling with fine liquor inside, peppermint schnapps, or whatever the Germans wanted to drink, cognac, and so on, that he himself produced. So I grew up in a big family. I have no siblings, but there were 6 of us living in the same house, 6 cousins. And they were like brothers and sisters to me, and they're still my best friends. So that was my family life. And the large family was something important for me because, like I said, I didn't have a mother, really. By the way, talking about not having mothers or broken families, if you look around at a lot of the successful people, Obama came from a broken family. I think President Clinton came from a broken family. I think even President Reagan, I'm not totally sure there. But a lot of pretty successful people came from homes that were broken homes almost. And they learned to rely on themselves early, therefore had more self-reliance, and they were able to have great careers later on. It's not a handicap.
That makes me think another question. So kind of talking about younger people today and how it's really difficult for so many of them. And part of it, there's arguably a lot of reasons, but part of it is that they're just scared of failure. And as we know, having lived a few years, failure is often a growth opportunity. Could you share an example of a failure or misstep, either professional or personal, that taught you an enduring lesson?
Oh, the really bad failures, I don't have any in my life. Bad decision was leaving UCLA and going to the University of Hawaii. UCLA, the chairman of the UCLA Economics Department had moved to the University of Hawaii as a dean of the graduate school, and then he became the president of the University of Hawaii, a fellow by the name of Witz Gorter. And when he was in Hawaii then, he started to pull people from UCLA over to Hawaii. I was 30 years old. He said, come over for a semester to visit at the University of Hawaii. I came and visited for a summer semester. And then they made me a real offer with a promotion involved and more money as well. And for a 30-year-old guy, unmarried, Hawaii was paradise, I thought. Lots of people running around, the beaches were there. But pretty soon, I discovered that Hawaii was not professionally, the University of Hawaii was not a step up for me. And it was a mistake to have left UCLA for Hawaii for professional reasons. So then I started to look around to go someplace else. And a friend of mine, his name was Rudy Romberg, who was working at the International Monetary Fund, he made me an offer, and I moved to the IMF in Washington, and thereby started my connections with the central banks in essentially a different way. I moved away from the academic world. I continued to teach when I was at Bank of America, for instance, here in San Francisco. I continued to teach at UC Berkeley in their business school courses, and again in international finance and international business. And that was good, that was exciting, and that was very rewarding. So I had made a mistake going to Hawaii. I was able to reverse and go in a different direction. And so in the end, it really didn't hurt me, because if I had stayed at UCLA, I probably would have stayed there my entire career. And I would not have had the opportunity to go to the IMF or to go to the Federal Reserve or to work for Bank of America or Visa for that matter. One always leads to another one. And if you make a wrong decision, reverse, change. Don't just sit it out and say, oh, woe me. If you make a mistake, or let's put it that way. If you don't succeed at first, try, and try again. That's what you have to learn.
Yeah. Great story.
Yeah. So when you look back on your career, what habits did you stick to that you think helped keep you growing, keep you learning over the decades?
Reading. I'm not a fast reader, but I love to read. And by the way, I love reading biographies because you learn so much what other people write and how their life evolved. And so reading biographies, I'm reading two at the present time. One, Herbert Grubel, who teaches now at Simon Fraser University in Canada, or he's retired from there. But before that, he got a Yale PhD. He taught at the University of Chicago. He taught at Stanford. He taught at the University of Pennsylvania before going to Simon Fraser. So another biography I'm just starting out is Tom Sowell from the Hoover Institution, who actually had the office next to me for a brief period of time at UCLA. And so you learn from people. And Tom Sowell, the obstacles that he had to overcome having born in the South, then being raised in Harlem, and starting out with these difficulties. I look at myself, I had it easy.
You have a favorite biography?
Those two are really good.
Are they good? Yep.
Well, if you were to give a message to younger leaders, investors, or professionals from all industries, what would your message be?
Well, I just said it a minute ago. If you don't succeed at first, try again. Don't give up. There are things that will happen, hopefully not many of them, but sometimes you'll be blown off course, or you have made the wrong decision. And then it's time to correct. And having that experience in your life will make you a stronger leader someplace else. And one door will open further doors for you. For instance, when I was young, I think a lot of people had a career with one corporation, one company. Nowadays, that's not favorable anymore. Nowadays, people go 3-4 years, one job, the next job, next job. And that was really my life. I had a lot of different jobs, and each job gave me one additional qualification for something else later on in life. So change is an important thing. You don't necessarily have to change companies, but even if you're with a big company, do different things within the same company. If you're with, a large firm, a Google, IBM, a Bank of America or so, you can be in retail, you can be in wholesale, you can be in investment management, and the financial thing, go to marketing, and then eventually you have all the boxes checked so that you can be the CEO and the president of the company.
So, Bob, I have one more question for you, and that is, big picture, what are you optimistic or concerned about regarding the future? And I'm talking about for the financial markets and for financial institutions.
I think the thing that worries me most is the current state of the federal debt. The federal debt has become so large that it is, the interest payments on the debt alone are bigger than our defense expenditures. That's not the way a world-leading country can succeed. Therefore, I was a great fan of reducing the size of the federal government and really trimming down and, slimming it down. Do only the necessary things. Earlier, I mentioned there are about 5 bank supervisory agencies on the federal level alone. There's too much duplication. Get rid of the agencies, consolidate them, and it doesn't make sense to have 3-4 different sets of bank examiners running around. I was even part of that problem. I was a part of a thing called the CCFG. I don't even remember now what it stands for. The Federal Financial Institutions Coordinating Committee, or FFIEC was called. Federal Financial Institutions Coordinating Committee. 5 initials. That thing still exists. And it's because there's so many different federal financial regulators that come up with different rules and regulations that they have to be coordinated in itself. What kind of a mess can we create for the banking system? But, I think keep it simple. That was Maggie Thatcher's watchword, and President Reagan as well. Keep it simple, stupid. That's the good advice that I would give anybody.
Yeah.
Always good advice. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you and hear your story. We so appreciate it. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And before we let you go, how can our listeners find your book? Where can they go to find it?
Amazon is the easiest way to find it. Amazon.com, and it's called The Unlikely Governor by Robert Heller. Thank you very much, Rusty and Robin. Appreciate
Hey,
it.
Bob, I do have one more question. I said I only had one more, but I do have one more. Something that people can't see, of course, is your office. We can see it, and it looks awesome. It's, as a Federal Reserve governor should have. It's wood, it's leather, it's perfect. But I can't make out the 3 wall hangings. I'm sure they're really important and really cool. What are they?
Oh, there's one picture that is the President Reagan gave me the announcement of my appointment as a governor of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
And then next to it hangs my goodbye present from Chairman Greenspan. And you see 12 Federal Reserve notes, $1 bills that are on that, that are part of that picture. And they are from the $1 bills issued by the different Federal Reserve districts. And they're all the calling cards and signatures of all the 12 Federal Reserve presidents and the 6 other governors, including Chairman Greenspan. That was my goodbye present from the board. And I also have another third one hanging there, big picture of the entire Federal Reserve Board, all the living governors in 2013 at the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve. But you see a big flag standing behind me as well.
Yeah.
Actually, I designed that flag myself with the help of my 2 children, Kimberly and Christopher. And that's the official flag of the United States Federal Reserve System and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve didn't have a flag. When I got there, I was always jealous that Chairman Volcker had a lot of different flags sitting behind his desk. I wanted to have a flag, but the Federal Reserve didn't have a flag. So when I became the administrative governor, I said, now I have the power to get a flag for the Federal Reserve System. I grabbed the seal of the Federal Reserve, took it home, a Xerox copy of it, had my kids color it in. Too bad I can't show it to you live here. But that is the official design of the Federal Reserve flag, done by my daughter, Kimberly, who is now a professor at Stanford in the medical school there. My son also had a flag designed. He was about 5, 6 years old when he did that. He liked pirates a lot, and it looks like a pirate flag. It's all black with a red border around it. Well, the Federal Reserve flag, the actual Federal Reserve flag, is a lot prettier, and that's my daughter's wonderful work.
Well, that's great. Looks like a very cozy office with lots of stories. Very cool. Well, Bob, thank you so much for your time today. And as I mentioned earlier, your story is so rich that we didn't have enough time to go into everything, but we do appreciate the time you gave us, so thank you.
Great talking to you both. Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert.
Me too. Well, we'll be back next week. Thanks for listening to Invest Well, Be Well. Let us know what you think, and if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe.
This podcast is hosted by Rusty Vanneman and Robin Murray and produced by Garrett Crosby.
If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or just want to connect, please visit my website, rustysbridge.com, or email me directly at rusty@rustysbridge.com. Until next time, invest well and be well. This episode of Invest Well, Be Well is brought to you by Bonrian Capital, led by my friend and colleague of nearly 10 years, Shana Sissel. Shana was named a top 20 wealth tech CEO in 2025, and it's no surprise. She's passionate, does the work, and knows asset managers, portfolio allocations, and alternatives like few others in the business. She's authentic, tough, and deeply cares about all her stakeholders, the kind of character you'd expect from the daughter of a police officer. If you want an investment manager who combines deep due diligence with innovative solutions and alternative investments, please check out Bonrian Capital at bonriancapital.com.